was a man in our church district who turned 71 years old this past spring, and by the time summer came around, he had lost 60 pounds off his frame without ever setting foot on a treadmill or signing up for one of those exercise programs you see people paying good money for on the television. His name is Ivan Schrock, and I want to tell you his story today because what worked for him did not cost him a dime, and it did not ask him to do anything his own grandfather wouldn't recognize. I'm Anna Beiler. I grew up plain, out past the county line where the men still work the fields with a team of horses, and the women put up their own vegetables every fall. My mother used to say that the good Lord gave a body legs and a stomach and expected you to use good sense with both of them. And I've come to believe there's more truth in that little saying than in most of what gets printed in the health magazines these days. So let me tell you about Ivan and about what he changed. And maybe by the end of it, you'll see something in his story that fits your own kitchen table. Ivan is not the kind of man who exercises. He never has been. He farmed for close to 50 years, and by the time he handed the place over to his son and moved into the smaller house next door, his knees had had about enough of ladders and hay bales. Walking to the mailbox and back was plenty of exertion for one afternoon, in his own words. The weight had crept up on him slowly, the way it does on a lot of men once the heavy field work stops, but the appetite built up over 50 years of it doesn't. His daughter showed him a photograph from a family reunion 2 summers back, and Ivan said that was the first time he really saw it, saw how his shirt buttons were straining, and how he'd had to stand off to the side of the group picture because bending his knees to sit on the porch step for it had gotten to be a chore. He'd taken to loosening his suspenders after supper and pretending it was just the heat. So when I tell you he lost 60 pounds, I want to be honest with you up front. He did not do it by running or lifting weights or joining a gym none of us plain folks would have use for anyway. He did it by changing what and when he ate, and by paying attention to a few old habits that his own father followed without ever having a name for them. If this is the kind of plain, useful help you came looking for, go ahead and subscribe, and tell me down in the comments what state you are watching from. A lot of you watching this are probably in the same spot Ivan was in. Your knees or your hips or your back have told you plainly that a jogging trail or an exercise class isn't in the cards for you anymore. And every article you come across about losing weight starts with a workout plan that assumes a body that can still do jumping jacks on a gym floor. Ivan's body couldn't do that either, and I don't imagine mine could at this point. So if that's been keeping you from trying anything at all, I want you to know this story isn't going to ask that of you. 2 winters ago, Ivan went in for his regular checkup, the kind his children had been after him to keep up with since his wife passed. The doctor weighed him and took his blood, and the number on the scale was one Ivan told me he hadn't seen since he was a younger man with a full head of dark hair. The doctor came back with a face Ivan said he didn't much care for. His blood sugar was sitting right at the edge of what they call pre-diabetic. His blood pressure needed a pill he'd never had to take before. And his knees, the doctor told him plainly, were carrying about 40 more pounds than they were built to hold at his age. The doctor didn't lecture him. He just laid the numbers out and told Ivan that if things kept on the way they were going, he'd likely be looking at insulin within 5 years and a knee replacement not long after that. Ivan told me later that it wasn't fear that got him moving. Not exactly. It was more that he pictured himself unable to walk out to check on his son's cattle of a morning, unable to sit on the porch and whittle without his knees aching something fierce, and that picture didn't sit right with him. So he went home and he didn't buy anything, and he didn't sign up for anything, and he didn't download anything onto a telephone, because Ivan doesn't own one of those either. He just started paying closer attention to his own table. If this is doing you some good so far, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you when it is ready. One of the first things Ivan changed was when he ate his last meal of the day. Growing up, his family finished supper before the light went, because lamp oil cost money, and nobody wanted to be cooking after dark if they didn't have to. Somewhere over the years, like most everyone else, Ivan had drifted into eating supper at 6 or 7, and then picking at things right up until bedtime. A piece of pie here, a handful of crackers there. He went back to his father's old habit. Supper by 5:30, and nothing after it but water or a cup of decaffeinated coffee. That gave his body a stretch of 12 or 13 hours some nights with nothing coming in, which is longer than it sounds once you're used to snacking through the evening. He told me the first 2 weeks were hard on him, that his stomach growled something awful around 8 o'clock out of pure habit rather than real hunger. But by the 3rd week, the growling had mostly quit, and he noticed he was waking up hungry for breakfast in a way he hadn't been in years, which he took as a good sign, and it was. Something else he picked up came from watching his own habits more closely than he ever had before. Before he sits down to any meal now, he drinks 1 full glass of water first, and he waits a few minutes before he picks up his fork. His late wife used to do this without ever explaining why, and Ivan always assumed it was just one of her habits. Turns out there's real sense behind it. A stomach that's had a little water in it sends a fuller signal to the brain sooner, and Ivan found he was putting less on his plate without even trying to. He wasn't restricting himself. He simply wasn't as hungry as he thought he was 5 minutes before he sat down. He also changed how much was going onto the plate in the first place. Ivan never counted a calorie in his life, and he wasn't about to start at 71. Instead, he went back to something his mother used to say, which was that a body's meat and starch should fit in the palm of one hand, no bigger. He started serving himself that way. Meat about the size of his palm, potatoes or noodles about the size of his fist, and then he let vegetables fill up whatever room was left on the plate. No seconds. If he was still a little hungry 20 minutes after eating, which happened rarely, he'd have a piece of fruit rather than going back for more of the main meal. Store-bought snacks went next, and this was harder on him than he expected. Ivan had a habit of keeping a bag of chips or a box of crackers on the counter for whenever he wandered through the kitchen, which turned out to be several times a day once he was retired and had no field to be walking off to. He emptied the cupboard of anything that came wrapped in plastic with a long list of ingredients he couldn't pronounce, and in its place, he started keeping a bowl of walnuts and a plate of hard-boiled eggs in the icebox, along with whatever fruit was in season. When he wanted bread, his daughter baked him a loaf on Saturdays, rather than him buying the soft white kind from the store, and he found that a slice of that with a little butter filled him up in a way 3 or 4 crackers never had. The wandering through the kitchen habit didn't go away entirely, but what he reached for changed completely, and that made most of the difference. Coffee was harder to give up than the crackers had been. Ivan had taken 3 spoons of sugar in his coffee every morning of his adult life, twice a day, cup after cup. He switched to black coffee with nothing in it, cold turkey, and he told me plainly that the first week tasted like punishment. By the 2nd week, he couldn't stand the thought of sweet coffee anymore. It tasted sickly to him. Between the coffee and cutting soda out entirely, which he'd been drinking with his lunch most days, Ivan figures he cut somewhere around 400 calories a day just from liquid he wasn't even thinking of as food. None of what I've told you so far involved exercise, and I want to be straight with you about the part that did involve movement, because Ivan would want me to be honest rather than sell you something that isn't true. He did walk more. Not on a treadmill, and not because a doctor prescribed it as exercise, but because once his energy came back and his knees started hurting less from carrying less weight, he found himself naturally walking out to his son's barn most mornings instead of driving the little cart he used to take. He walked to church on Sundays when the weather allowed it instead of getting a ride, about 3/4 of a mile each way. He'd tell you he wasn't exercising. He was just living his life the way his body was starting to let him again. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you believe 60 pounds came off a man who never once stood up from his chair. The walking was real. It just wasn't a program, and it wasn't the thing he did first. It came after, almost on its own, once the weight started coming off, and his knees stopped complaining. Sleep turned out to matter as much as anything Ivan put on his plate. For years, he'd been staying up past 10, watching the news or reading, then dragging himself up at 6 because the day demanded it, running on 6 hours of sleep most nights. He pushed his bedtime back to 9 and let himself wake naturally around 5:30, and something in his appetite changed. He wasn't near as hungry during the day, and the evening cravings that used to send him to the pie plate mostly disappeared. I've read a little on this since, enough to understand there's a real reason for it. A tired body produces more of the hormone that tells you you're hungry and less of the one that tells you you're full. Ivan didn't know any of that. He just knew that a rested man doesn't eat the way a tired one does, and his own mother could have told him the same thing 60 years ago without ever having heard the words hormone or metabolism. Where he ate mattered too. He made it a rule that food only got eaten sitting at the table, plate in front of him, nothing else going on. No eating standing up at the counter, no plate on his lap in front of the radio. It sounds like a small thing, and it is a small thing, but he told me it cut out an enormous amount of what he called mindless nibbling, the kind of eating you do without even tasting it, because your attention is somewhere else entirely. When food was the only thing happening, he ate less of it and enjoyed it more, which is a trade most people would take if they thought about it plainly. Ivan's family noticed before he did, in a lot of ways. At Christmas, his grandchildren asked him to come sledding with them down the hill behind the barn, something he hadn't done in years because his knees wouldn't have carried him back up. He went. His son mentioned, "Careful not to make too much of it." That Ivan had started tucking his shirt in again instead of leaving it loose the way he had for years. At a wedding this past June, an old friend from 2 districts over didn't recognize him at first and asked Ivan's brother who the stranger by the punch bowl was. Ivan laughed about that one for weeks. None of that was the point when he started. He'll tell you, the point was just being able to walk out to the barn without his knees complaining. But he won't pretend the noticing didn't feel good too. The hardest test of all this came at that same June wedding, if you ask me, standing in front of a dessert table loaded with the kind of shoe-fly pie and whoopie pies our community turns out for every celebration. Ivan didn't turn away from the table entirely. He told me he'd learned early on that telling himself he could never have a thing again just made him want it worse. Instead, he took one small piece, ate it slowly, sitting down at the table the way he'd been practicing for over a year by then, and left it at that. He said the old Ivan would have eaten a piece standing up by the table, talking to 3 different people, and never really noticed the eating at all, then gone back for a second piece without thinking twice. The new habit wasn't about never having pie, it was about noticing that he was having it, and stopping when the piece was gone instead of when the table was. I'll tell you the timeline now, because I think it matters, and because I don't want to leave you with the idea that this happened overnight. In the first month, Ivan lost about 8 pounds, mostly water weight from cutting the late-night eating and the sugar. By 3 months, he was down 18 pounds total, and that's about where his energy really started to turn around, where the walking started happening on its own instead of feeling like an effort. By 6 months, he'd lost 35 pounds. His old work trousers had gone loose enough that he took them to have the waist taken in, and his doctor at his next checkup told him his blood sugar numbers had come back down out of the pre-diabetic range entirely. It took him right around 14 months to reach the full 60 pounds, and he's kept it off for close to 8 months now by simply continuing to eat the way he'd taught himself to eat. He didn't go back to the old way once the weight came off, because the new way had just become his way. He kneels in his garden now without needing a hand up, and he told me last month that he'd climbed the stairs to his son's hayloft without stopping to catch his breath partway up, which he hadn't managed in longer than he cared to admit. I want to say a word of caution here, because I wouldn't feel right leaving it out. Ivan was already seeing his doctor regularly, and he made these changes with that doctor's knowledge, particularly around the blood pressure medication, since losing weight can change how much medicine a body needs, and that's not something to adjust on your own. If you're carrying weight you'd like to lose, and you're on medication for your heart, your blood sugar, or your blood pressure, talk to your doctor before you change how you're eating, especially something like pushing your last meal earlier in the day. That kind of change affects blood sugar, and it can affect how medication behaves in your system. This is not something to guess your way through, particularly past the age of 60 or 70, when a body doesn't bounce back from mistakes the way it did at 30. And I'll say plainly that not every body responds the same way. Ivan's knees and Ivan's heart are his own, and yours are your own, and a doctor who knows your history is worth more than any story I can tell you. If you wanted to try something like this yourself, Ivan's own advice, for whatever it's worth from a farmer who never studied nutrition a day in his life, is to change one thing at a time rather than all 7 at once. He didn't overhaul his whole kitchen in a single week. He moved his supper time earlier first and let that settle in for a couple of weeks before he touched anything else. Then he tackled the water before meals, then the portions. He said, trying to change everything on the first Monday of January, the way so many people do, is exactly how a person ends up quitting by the middle of February. One habit, given a few weeks to stop feeling like an effort and start feeling like simply how you live, is worth more than 5 habits taken on all at once and abandoned by spring. What worked for Ivan worked because he stayed with it for over a year, not because any single piece of it was some kind of magic. There's no pill in this story. There's an old man who ate supper earlier, drank a glass of water before his meals, served himself smaller portions on purpose, cleared the packaged snacks out of his cupboard, cut the sugar out of his coffee, went to bed at a decent hour, and ate sitting down at his own table like his mother raised him to. None of it costs anything. None of it requires a gym membership, a subscription, or a device. It just requires doing it every single day for long enough that it stops feeling like a change and starts being who you are. His daughter has started doing a version of it too, the supper timing especially, since she was over at his place often enough in the beginning to see how much steadier his mood was by evening once he wasn't running on an empty stomach and short sleep at the same time. She told me she'd tried diets before that left her irritable and tired by 4 in the afternoon, and this wasn't that. Nobody in the family calls it a diet at all, in fact. Ivan doesn't like that word, and never has. He calls it eating like his father did, and I think that's closer to the truth of it than anything a magazine article would print. Ivan still doesn't own a telephone, and he still doesn't exercise in any way he'd put that word to, but he walks out to his son's barn most mornings now without his knees complaining, and he sits on his porch of an evening in a body that carries 60 fewer pounds than it did 2 years ago, and he tells anyone who asks that he didn't do anything complicated. He just went back to eating the way his own father ate, back before anybody needed a doctor to tell them how. Thank you for sitting with me through this. Subscribe if you want more old household wisdom, and the next video is right there on your screen when you are ready for it.